right, guys, welcome back to the Jay Martin Show. And I'm joined once again by Bart Elmore. Bart, it's really good to have you back on, man.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
So I think it was, I don't know, 6 months. When was it? It was maybe a year ago. You had just put out the book that's over your left shoulder right now called Seed Money. Fascinating walk through the origins of Monsanto and the relationship with Coca-Cola. And was that about a year ago?
Yeah, I think it was October. So yeah, a little bit over at this point. Yeah.
A little bit over. Okay. Now, a couple of reasons I wanted to chat with you again. Number one, I know you just finalized your next book, and I want to talk about that and catch up on what inspired you and what you're writing about. And secondly, I did want to follow up on Monsanto news, right? This was a book that completely captured my attention. And what was so interesting about the timing was that, you know, when we chatted, Bayer, had just purchased Monsanto, and they were walking into tens of billions of dollars of lawsuits from the Roundup litigations. And what I found so curious about this recently was that it looked like Beyer had bought an absolute dog and made a horrible mistake with this acquisition. And essentially, the stock was tanking accordingly. They got wiped out in the first three lawsuits to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and then a $10 billion settlement. But they've turned the tide since and been able to prove in court that there's no relationship between Roundup and cancer. And I was just curious if you've been watching that, and if you have any thoughts to share on that, because it's shocked me, and I wondered if it had shocked you as well.
Yeah, Jay, it's a great question. I don't know if it shocked me, because I think I recognize that proving that something like glyphosate causes cancer one way or the other was just going to be a challenge, and I remember doing my own research into this area, and we may have talked about it last time, because I was as anyone would be writing about this, I knew I was going to have to kind of engage with these questions. And the backstory there was, when I went to undergrad, I was interested in biochem. I started as a biochem major, and I worked at the labs and worked on various PCR machines and stuff. So I kind of was interested in the science and reading up, what can we know? And I just felt like at the end of the day, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to really weigh in one way or the other. I don't think in this book I took a stand one way or the other about where we're at with that, because science is hard. It's how do you prove it? A lot of things cause cancer. It's really difficult. And so what I wanted to do was lay out what we knew, what documents were in there. I think the most damning documents, the ones that really led to, I think, the jury giving a verdict against Monsanto and Bayer in those early trials, was evidence that they were kind of, massaging the data and talking to these close relationships with the regulators, the kind of ghostwriting of op-eds. These are clear from the discovery documents that were released.
Right.
And so I think it opened an avenue for some of those early successes. And just in the same way that, I think you got to be skeptical both ways. I'm skeptical that, just because these juries made this decision in this moment, that's going to be the end all be all outcome of all this. Right. So what I will say, and I'll end with this, is that I do think there's within Bayer a sense that, obviously when you're winning multiple cases back to back, as they've done since last year, there's a sense that we're on the right track and that we've got a handle on this. But as we were talking briefly before this, I think there's a lot of other issues that they're facing that they haven't really fixed. And I think, I haven't looked currently at their stock price and where they're at today, but, they haven't fully recovered. This is a company that's still trying to find its legs after losing basically half of its market cap. So
totally. Yeah.
I think they're not out of the woods, and just because there's been some good news, I don't think it's the end of the story. I think they're clearly happy inside Bayer. We can talk about how I know that, but yeah, that's that's kind of where I land on.
I want to talk about how you know that as
Yeah.
much as we can. Okay, that's an interesting perspective. The reason it struck me is because, in my household, for example, my wife and I are super conscious about what we have in our pantry and what's in our refrigerator. And you can go down the food rabbit hole forever. I mean, this, right? It never ends if you're looking at eliminating carcinogens, toxins, like glyphosate, for example, phthalates, like whatever it is that you think is offending your system and you want to remove from your food supply within your home. That's a never-ending journey. And it can make you feel a bit neurotic sometimes, especially when I'm talking with friends who maybe don't go down that path. And they're like, what are you making such a big deal? Like, look, this wouldn't be on the shelves. It was as unsafe as you're telling me it is. And I think that's crazy. So when I saw, 3 winning trials, and it was like $191 million awarded to individuals who were pointing the finger at glyphosate and saying, this stuff's really, really dangerous and people need to know about it. The optimist in me was like, yes, this is going to become widespread public knowledge and things will really change. And obviously things don't always work like that. And a corporation with endless funds to hire the most sophisticated legal teams in the world is going to figure out how to win that game. And looks like they figured out how to win that game. So 2
Currently,
questions.
But again, Jay, like, who knows? And I think for investors and things like this could go one way or the other. And it's also different jurisdictions, talking about courts out in California, which were the original ones, which you could argue maybe given who came into that particular jury and having been a person who sat in on some of these trials, or either what the glyphosate trials I ended up watching from afar, but, I sat in on the dicamba trials for Monsanto, and it's just the luck of the draw of who you can get in that jury pool can make a huge difference in how the outcomes play out. So I just think that, pause, because we'll see what happens as we go forward. I think it's definitely a kind of change in the tide legally for Bayer now, but things may change because I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about, it's just the scale of glyphosate and how much is out there. I think it's just a question of like, what are some of the things we're missing? What are some of the things we're not fully understanding about the connections between this chemical and not just our health, but the health of ecosystems. So I think the jury is still out. It certainly is in my own mind, like I'm working to still try and understand it. I think the science is, there's still a lot of research that can be done to kind of figure out where, what's the story with this product.
Can I ask now, because it's been over a year since this book was published, what has the response, maybe the blowback been? And let's back up a minute, because for someone who didn't watch our previous interview, has not read Seed Money, maybe start with like a 30-second recap of the concepts and the topic. But then, in the last year and a half, talk to me about, has there been any blowback? Like, I know there's been some great recognition, and I'd love to talk about that. And also, has there been any pushback from corporates, parties, anything like this against the content?
Yeah. So Jay, we, took about a decade, start to finish, to kind of write this book on the history of Monsanto. And for people who don't know Monsanto, this is a company that was started in St. Louis in 1901 as a chemical firm, mainly producing artificial sweeteners and caffeine for Coca-Cola, of all things. And then it morphed over time into the largest seller of genetically engineered seeds in the world. It became one of the biggest producers of the most popular herbicide in the world, Roundup, glyphosate. That became, of course, as we just talked about, the center of all these big pieces of litigation. Monsanto ultimately was bought by Bayer, a German life sciences company. Think of Bayer, aspirin, same company. And most people saw that as just a really unwise move, in the sense that within a matter of months after buying Monsanto, because of this litigation, they were worth essentially half of what they were worth before they bought the company. And so my book kind of traces that whole story, and which I didn't see coming, by the way. That all happened. The end story happened while I was writing the book. So I was almost like a journalist, even though I'm a historian by trade, looking at that. And so it was a really interesting journey that ended right in this kind of critical moment. And so the book came out right as all this kind of catastrophe was playing out for Bayer. And so to blowback, so this book comes out, and here I am, an environmental historian at Ohio State, kind of wondering what's going to be the response of this company that's now acquired Monsanto? And that was kind of the interesting thing. You know, I had written thinking that I was going to be writing about a company that was going to be still in existence.
Yes.
But in fact, it was now merged with this bigger firm. And so I didn't really know what to think. Prior to this, I'd written a book on Coca-Cola, and my expectation was the usual situation. The company was going to put out op-eds and things to try and say, this is a terrible book and you should never buy it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what happened with Coke. Incidentally, if people end up purchasing Citizen Coke, which was my first book on the history of Coca-Cola, you'll see on the back that we have two endorsements. The Wall Street Journal basically says, hey, you know, we looked at this book and it, you know, it's a pretty eye-opening account of Coke's history. And you'll see the other blurb is from Coca-Cola that says, this book is total crap. Don't buy it because it's, you know, it's full of shit. So that was kind of what I was expecting. And I just should mention that what that's like as a writer when you're young. I mean, when I first wrote that, I was in my 20s when I was writing it, the Coke book. You know, I didn't have a massive legal team behind me. I certainly have lawyers in my family, but, you know, it was like, what's going to happen? I mean, I remember, you know, it was really intimidating. Like I would write pieces for Fortune magazine, for example. And then, you know, the next day Fortune would write me and say, Coke is, you know, responding. But it was interestingly Fortune that turned down Coca-Cola's request to write a response to my book because they called out their bluff. They said, look, you say this book is inaccurate. We want you to tell us what's inaccurate in this book. And I really applaud them for that, because Coke was forced to, in an email, basically say, and I'm paraphrasing what they said, but Fortune showed it to me. They said, you know, Bart's book does not have any factual inaccuracies, but we just disagree with his interpretation. And Fortune magazine basically did not publish Coca-Cola's response, which was incredible. I remember feeling so kind of supported by this huge business magazine, you know, that should have been supporting Coke. Yeah, it gives them a lot more money probably than lowly historians like me. So, so that was kind of what I thought. And then I get this email sitting right here, exactly where I am. Opened up my Outlook, and it's from this guy at Beyer. And he says, congratulations. This was an incredible book. I learned a lot. And if you'd be up for it, I'd like to talk. And of course, immediately I thought, what's going on? You know, is this a firm? Like, what's the strategy here? Is there like some ulterior motive and whatever else? We talked a long time off the record for several months, but I can now say it was the senior vice president of the company. He has since come to Ohio State. We have actually had a on-the-record conversation here at the university about that moment of him seeing the book. And he remembers reading a line that I put in the introduction intentionally. And it was such a like mind-blowing moment, Jay, to hear this, because like he basically said he read that line that I had kind of put in there for him to read, I didn't know him, but for someone like him to read. I said, like, I know there are good people inside this company who want to do the right thing. And I hope that you'll take this book seriously, because you could learn something from it, you know? And he said, I don't know, in one of our conversations, he said something like, it was like the Mona Lisa, you know, when you go into like art galleries, and the picture is like looking at you.
Yes.
He was, it felt like the book was looking at me. And so over the course of a year, we just talked off the record, and I flew to
what did he want to talk about? So, you know, this piece could be interpreted as a bit of a hit piece, you know, on a company they just acquired, he's now in charge of, and he reaches out and he wants to talk to you. And for a year and a half, you guys talk off the record. Like, what was he after? What did he want to, was he looking for solutions for the betterment of the company, or what do you think, what was going on?
Yeah. At first, I was extremely wary.
Yeah.
About even talking
to
somebody, you know, because I thought, what's the game?
do you think there was some risk of like legal entrapment, or what were you worried about?
It's funny because when, to fast forward to the end of the story, when he came to Ohio, that was a particularly touchy moment because we had a film crew here, and like you could tell he was taking a risk. He was taking a risk at that moment because he had signed a release and we were here in, my home turf. And, his reputation was on the line, and really, to be honest, his job in some ways, because he had taken this risk. And it was interesting. We started out with a film crew at my house, and we sat down there at my house, and I just remember kind of being shaky. And I'm not generally a shaky person, but it was just like a really intense moment to have the senior vice president of a company. And as you said, it's not a hit job. I think one of the things I really tried to do was to make sure the book was really like try to be balanced as it possibly could be. But you're absolutely right. Like it did not hold any, I mean, it's hard on the company. Yeah. I mean, it shows documents that they don't want out there,
Yeah.
So it was really a weird moment to have him in my house. And we joked about this. Like I joked about my neighbors, for example, when the book came out, they came to my book talk, as one does. You have this big book celebration in your hometown, and the book comes out, and you have a signing. And they were there, and they raised a question, asked a question in the audience. They said, "Hey, Bart, do they know where you live?" And it was a inside joke to both of us. Everyone laughed when they found out they were my neighbors, because they're like, we're worried about them knowing. And so that day, of course, they're there at my house.
Yeah.
So they do know where I live. And it was funny, like he laughed about that, but it was kind of like this surreal moment where they're laughing about it, like, we do know where you live. But like we had gotten to a point, where we were talking about my kids, and we were talking about his kid, by this point we really knew each other. And so it was just a weird, like, moment of decompression, but also like very serious at the same time. And in that moment, I revealed to him something that he also laughed about, because he had invited me to the headquarters in Germany. And I had flown to the headquarters in Germany and met with people there in the middle of this kind of exchange. And my father, who's a lawyer, had really cautioned me about that. He said, "You're flying to Germany to talk to the company, be careful." And I told him that, and he kind of chuckled about it. Like, he was like, "Oh, you thought we were going to, like, do some lawsuit against you or something like that." And I said, "Well, put yourself in my shoes. Of course, I think, I got to be careful about things like that." Even though I think the content of the book, is as sound as it could possibly be, you just never know what's going to happen. So all those things were running through my mind. I think that I'll just say that the big turning point for me was talking to my friend Aaron Cochran, who was the kind of right-hand person for Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State. She'd been my best friend since sixth grade. And when this book came out, one of the things I did was I had her come on as one of my publicity team, because I trusted her 100%. We tried to cross country on bicycle together. Once you've done that, you've been through pretty much everything. And I talked to her about it. I said, "What do you think? What's going on here, and what should we do?" And I think the general thrust of those conversations was, there are good people in institutions, whether it be the State Department or whether, and even those institutions could do really horrible, terrible things, make bad choices.
Sure.
Let's give this a shot. Let's have a conversation. Let's be as humane as we can, and see what comes of it. And I think the last thing I'll say on this, Jay, is what I came to see is that I felt like this was a person that had a very genuine interest in doing good in the world. You can call me naive, and maybe 3 years from now, something will happen that will make me feel otherwise.
Sure.
But this was a person, had been elected the Green Party in the German Bundestag as the youngest person to be elected. The Green Party in Germany is like super environmental. And he had decided to go into the private sector because he felt like, look, I wasn't getting the impact I wanted in government. I really wanted to be inside the firms that were critical to changing our world. And again, you could say this is all fluff and just greenwashing, but after spending so much time with this person, I really think it's genuine. And thing that I think, though, I've learned is that just because this person is high up in that company doesn't mean that company's going to listen to him. It doesn't mean it's going to change.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I've kind of been sitting here I think that part of his strategy was to see if I could be a part of helping him tell that story internally and figuring out how, to get the firm. Again, this sounds so naive now. Looking back on it, I never would have thought I said it, but I think it's the person who wants to see if they can move the big ship in the right direction.
We actually need to have a damn good recession.
And so by the way I interpret that is this senior vice president likely came to you on his own accord. This was not a request from upper management saying, we got to deal with this. That's how I thought the story was going to go. When you started telling it, I was like, this guy was sent over to deal with the problem. But the way it evolved over the next year and a half, 2 years, more so led you to believe that this was an individual acting on his own accord, which is a really important bullet point, because you're right. You could say, oh, this is all fluff and greenwashing, as you mentioned, it could be. And that's kind of like the lazy way out. It's the faceless corporation. It's all one thing. And it's only ever going to be one thing, when in reality, it's, a large collection of human beings who are all unique with their own motivations and fears and drivers and all this stuff. And to add that humanness to at least one individual who reached out to you, and it's like, I don't know what the intention of the corporation is. I don't, right? But there's a collection of people that make up that organization, one of whom approached me to walk through this subject matter in greater detail and try to understand it better. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a product of how I wanted to write the book, which is why I think it happened the way it did. I hate books that talk about think about it, where the company does stuff. Coca-Cola did this. Now, Coca-Cola didn't do it. Somebody made a decision inside the company. Figure out who did that. Yeah.
Yes.
Who was the one who who was the one? And so that's the hard, we talked about 10 years, right? That's the hard work.
Yeah.
Not just looking from outside, but seeing how far you can get in to figure out who pulled that, triggers the bad analogy, but who pushed that button? Who was the one that made that call? That's when you're distinguishing people, figuring out who in the firm was doing the right things and who in the firm was doing the unethical things, because both happened in this book. I thought there were people in this book that I talked to, I consider them whistleblowers, that they were just good people, saw bad things happening. They're like, hey, I don't want to be a part of this, and I'd like to talk to you about it. There were others who I think, there was this moment with PCBs, which we should talk about, when 1969, where the executive literally writes, knowing that PCBs are super toxic. It's clear by 1969, and it's a confidential meeting. I have the doc. I copied it in the book, so you can see the doc for yourself. I really value that. I really value as a historian, let me show it to you. I don't want you to trust me. I want you to see it. And in this doc, it's handwritten note where he says, what should we do about this? Maybe we should, one, go out of the business of selling PCBs. And then number two, he scribbles, no, maybe we should sell the hell out of it as long as we possibly can and do nothing else. My job, I think, as a historian is to show you both this guy I'm talking about right now and that guy too.
And that guy. That's really important. Yeah.
And to show you how these things play out, and to see how those power dynamics of that person sometimes being higher. That's why that product's going to be put out. Whereas you have these other people who are saying I'm seeing real problems with this. So
that's important context.
Yeah. So I think, it's this journey is not over. I'm actually flying to see the person we're talking to about on Monday.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just kind of not satisfied where we left off our last conversation. I think this is a person that has considerable sway, and I'm just curious if through our conversations, can he actually affect change?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Interesting. I'm so curious how this plays out. And are you going back to Germany for this? Do you go back to the headquarters?
This is in DC. They have two, they have a US based headquarters and they have one overseas. So I've been to both, but I think, for investors out there, or people looking at this from just the perspective of like, what's going on with Beyer? Like, I hope this person's voice gets heard, because I think it leads to a different direction for the company. And I think it's one that's smarter. I think it's one that's, centering on how do we grow food more based on biology, as opposed to just like pure chemistry. We're just going to be dumping like what used to be called, by the way, economic poisons. That's what they called herbicides in the early 20th century. It's like a great term. They didn't even like hide it. They're like, these are poisons, because that's what they are.
Yeah.
To kill things. We got to think about a better way to do this, where we're not jeopardizing the health of our kids, where we're not jeopardizing the health of our ecosystems. And I think he's a person who could push the firm that way, but he's got to have that voice. He's got to be, and one wonders, like, what's my role as the historian? Do I now step back, or do I weigh in knowing what I know to say, look, here are the levers, here are the places where you could have an impact, given what I've seen. This is a person, in many of these cases, these people join the firm after I've been already spending 8 years studying it. They don't know, sometimes they don't know the history as well as scholars who are looking at this stuff, because they've been spending more time with it. They just got hired.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And timing here is interesting, because, we're heading in and experiencing, not in Canada where I live, but many parts of the world, a pretty intense squeeze on necessities like food and, and energy to produce food. And, the Russia-Ukraine war has taken something like 25% of the grain out of the world grain market. This is going to impact the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And the rush to produce food at scale will be very, very real. And people will be willing to turn a blind eye in order to get the product they need. I mean, that's just how squeezes work, right? You can act with tons of moral virtue when things are really good and life's easy and you live in a predictable, abundant world. But when things get hard, you do what you have to do, right? And I don't know if I just wonder how that plays out for a company like Beyer, right? The world's largest producer of genetically modified seeds, correct? And a lot of the fertilizers to grow them. I mean, that's potentially a huge asset in this new world. And are they able to sort of like skip over some of these toxic details in order to get product to market? Like, I wonder if they're sort of positioned just from a geopolitical standpoint right now, sort of beneficially. Does that make sense?
I thought the same thing. I actually thought about it from the perspective of the firm itself, actually, that because you're talking about kind of global pressures that might shape their activity. I was thinking more on the micro level that they just got punched in the face financially. Yeah. This is your world, right? Where a lot. I mean, I had to kind of come into it and understand how catastrophic this was by like understanding a little bit more of financial history to see how unusual it is for a company to have that kind of market cap collapse so fast too.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I remember in our early conversations, I remember being like, I recognize that you're kind of like in a tough spot. Because oftentimes when a company's dealing with something like that, they don't want to hear some guy coming in with like hippie ideas about how they're going to revolutionize, plant life and things like that. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I kind of had this almost like feeling that I needed to be a bigger voice in the room to say, no, this is your time as a business to totally rethink what you're doing. When you've collapsed this bad, you might as well, take that gamble to say, let's do something different. Let's totally rethink the way that we have thought about this. Instead of having this kind of war against nature mentality of like spray, 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 we're going to make money off this volume of herbicides, sales, regardless again of how this all shakes out in the courts with cancer and glyphosate. It's just a model that we can see has systemic problems. These are all based on finite natural resources. Like, you can't keep doing that in perpetuity. It's so fossil fuel dependent. It's like, a fifth grader can tell you that's there's no end game there. So this is the moment, in some ways you could argue, like at first I thought they're vulnerable, but then I'm like, maybe vulnerability is the opportunity for them to totally revolutionize what they're doing. And I would just say again, for those who are looking at this, my conversations lead me to think there's a chance that that's the case, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. The other path is just to say like, no, let's double down, like, because we need to get the profits back for whatever herbicide as fast as we can. Let's push that, the old way of doing things, just to get back on our feet. But I think it's a bad strategy if they do that.
I think it's a bad strategy too. But again, I get back to like, people do what they have to do. No one's invested in renewable energy more than Germany and France, and here they are burning coal today, right? And just because they do what they have to do, right? When humans' backs are against the wall, you take care of tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
At the cost of the day after that.
Yeah, I was there in Germany as that was happening, right? So I was visiting the headquarters as all this kind of chaos with Ukraine was happening. And I was thinking about that, just that very point that, it's so important as an environmental historian to think about the long term, but in those moments, people just are like, how am I going to put food on my table,
Exactly.
And that's why we have to revolutionize and rethink what we're doing, so we don't end up in these situations where we're so dependent on Russia, so dependent on whatever it is.
Yeah. So let's jump into the PCB discussion a little bit. I want to walk down that path, understand it a little bit better. Let's start with like an easy definition and use case part.
Yeah. Didn't know too much about it until I really started writing this book, but it's really worth, I think, everyone kind of paying attention to, both from again, I'm trying to think about, I talk to different groups of people, like different audiences, but some of your folks are interested in like, thinking about this from investment angles or whatever. One of the problems with PCBs is that they're a very persistent chemical and they're very toxic. Polychlorinated biphenyls, that's what PCBs are. We're basically an insulating material used, one could argue, in almost everything. First, really produced in large scale, 30s going into the 40s. And the really problematic thing for Monsanto / Beyer is that they were the only producer of this product in the United States. They produced it primarily out of two locations, what was then Monsanto, Illinois, but it became so toxic that they said, no, we don't want to call it Monsanto, Illinois. This is now Sauget, Illinois. So it's right across from St. Louis, right across the bridge going into East St. Louis. That's where the factory was for the production of polychlorinated biphenyls.
Okay.
The other facility was in Anniston, Alabama, kind of in between, going to Birmingham in Alabama.
Okay.
They were used a lot in electrical transformers and basically to prevent electrical fires. So it was fluid that was put into all sorts of things that might have fire. So anything that was electrical had, a lot of PCB insulation, but it was in everything from like carbonless paper to shoe polish to, I found examples of it in artificial Christmas trees because you don't want those to burn. It was in silos that lined our food. So like, to prevent silos from burning. It was in the paint in pools. So like to insulate the pools. It was in everything, highways, paint, everything. And by the 60s, scientists are investigating this and they're like, whoa, this stuff is like super toxic, super problematic, and can lead to all sorts of health issues. And really, we're also affecting wildlife. And there was all this really problematic studies. And internally, Monsanto is talking about this, and I write about these documents in the book. What's so damning, again, okay, you've got a company that's the only producer of this in the United States. It's now extremely toxic. One could argue that they could have legally gotten around a lot of the problems they're facing today, that is Beyer, if they had just said, like, we're not going to produce it. But instead, they kept producing it. And internally, they were like these memos saying things like, well, maybe we just sell the hell out of it as long as we possibly can. And those are the kind of damning documents that are being used in trial today, because this PCB contamination is still out there. And it's in everything. It's in schools, it's in hospitals, it's in all sorts of locations. It's in waterways. It's in the Ohio River here in Ohio and in the Puget Sound. It's everywhere. And you've got a company that in the United States, there were some other international producers, but they were very small. For the most part, they're the one.
The only one.
You're liable. It's out there.
Mhm.
And it never got cleaned up.
And that's the issue, right? Because it's banned from production today, correct? And has been for 30 years or so?
Was part of the initial 1970s laws. It was one of the chemicals that was specifically singled out in that early legislation in the 1970s that said, we're banning this because it's so toxic. And so, Monsanto obviously stops producing it. But it's all out there now. As this is all happening, by the way, General Electric, for example, is one of the biggest buyers of this stuff because they've got all these transformers and electrical equipment and things like that. Monsanto, by the way, in these documents has these are just really damning documents. That's why they're, I think, losing in all these court battles. You've got them saying things like, when should we tell our customers? Don't write this stuff down. I mean, when should we tell our customers? Well, now you should tell your customers. But instead, they engage in a series of strategies of writing indemnity agreements, like, okay, having their customers basically sign off on these contracts where the fine print is basically saying, like, you won't hold us liable if there's a problem with this stuff. Trying to pass basically responsibility onto these other companies, even though, of course, Monsanto is the closest to this product, knows more about its toxicity than probably anybody else.
Yeah.
So, fast forward to the 21st century, and here we are in a world in which PCB contamination is still out there. And you have states and cities and everyone else that have started filing these massive lawsuits saying, come clean up our stuff, Monsanto. And now Beyer.
Now Beyer.
So Bayer's sitting there like going around to all these different places trying to deal with it. And I don't know if they have any answer.
Well, because when you think about the scale that, you just listed off, food
Everything.
silos, swimming pools, like it's a coolant, it's a lubricant, it's an insulator, it's in so many industrial products, it's in the waterways already. To wrap your mind around, I don't think you can, around like, what does environmental remediation even look like? And do we have the technology to complete that? Do we? Like, how do you go about measuring the success of a decrease in PCBs? Like, how in the environment when, it's a struggle. You look at, I think about the mining industry, for example, right? You wrap up a mining project, the company has to hold, the equivalent billions assumed to cost to complete remediation post closing the mine, right? This cash is held in bond. Once the mine's closed down, that cash is distributed back to the mine after cleanup's been completed. But it's a local area. Like you can kind of measure the impact, right?
Exactly.
How do you even begin this process?
I don't know. And that's the thing. I feel like, I don't want to go too much into the conversations we've had about that, because I think some of those conversations were ones that were in that early phase where we talked about it off the record. But my sense, I don't have an answer for them. And that, and that was like a real weird moment for me, because I remember when this first started, I was thinking about my top things when he sent me that email. And I was like, okay, if I was in the room and now I'm in the room, what would I talk about? The first is like, you've got to see this glyphosate path as like, just a path that regardless, it's just not your path forward, regardless of how these cases play out, like you've got to pivot now and hard off this to like figure out another way to do it. Dicamba, which we haven't talked about before, this like volatile chemical that drifts. I think we talked about that last time, onto other people's farms, and like, it's volatile. They knew it. They sold it anyways. Same documentation. They're losing these cases. It's terrible. Like, they know that's a product that should go. And I was like, okay, that needs to get pulled. These are like things I'm thinking about, right? Agent Orange. Monsanto was the largest producer of Agent Orange by volume for the US military. They had evidence inside their own, once again, inside their own facilities that this stuff was super toxic. They sold it to the military anyway. It affected people. My father, for example, the Vietnam vet, is receiving Agent Orange payments in part because he has prostate cancer and it's linked to this. Now, is it linked? Again, go back to this. Did that cause prostate cancer? How do you prove it, right?
Yeah.
But my dad would say that too. Nobody's trying to say we know for sure, but like we know that these things are linked. So you've got this contaminant that's out there. But yet Monsanto has paid nothing to the Vietnam citizens or to the cleanup operations now ongoing in Vietnam. So these all seem like, some of these seem like low-hanging fruit to me. Yeah, the Vietnam situation, for example. And I think we've made headway in some of our conversations on that. What should Bayer do? They knew it was bad. The evidence in this book shows that it was. They did it anyway. It didn't get cleaned up. People are harmed by it. If you're saying you're a moral company, you've acquired Monsanto. That means you've acquired their history. What's your obligation to go in there and do something about it? But then I got to PCBs, which was obviously way up there because it's still this persistent contaminant that's affecting all of us. And I was like, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
I tried to put because I was trying to put myself in his shoes. Like, what's the ask? Agent Orange, easy. Go there, like be a part of these cleanup operations, help pay for some of the medical relief. These are targeted locations in some cases, but there's a lot of liability there. And I get that. They don't want to get tied up in that, but it's the right thing to do. PCBs, I just don't even know where to start. And I don't think they do. So I think if you're looking at this, again, if you're just looking at it from a business angle, this is a big boogeyman for them. And I don't think I think it may have even been almost like they were so focused on Roundup and maybe figured out they have an angle to deal with that. But I'm not so sure they have the answer to this one.
And where would the vulnerable spot come from, do you think, Bart? Because I think like I'm exposed to PCBs, but it's probably because of my curtains over there, maybe the hot tub over here. Like you can't really point the finger, it's like, well, if we're talking about this environmental carcinogen that is almost everywhere, how am I supposed to? So then would it be maybe the companies that are using this, like who would be the impacted person who could directly say, and what would they be affected by? Is it liver disease? Like what does PCB and
I think that's what makes this whole chemical age, coming out of the chemical age, if we can call it that. If you really think about it, none of these things existed pre-1930s, 40s. This was all a product of that petrochemical boom that came out of that oil boom, and you're making all these different things from petrochemical products. And at the time, it seemed like magic. Like that's why they were doing it. And in a way, you go back to this book, like, yes, there were people that did unethical choices, but in the 30s and 40s, they're just like, this is amazing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, it's a cautionary tale for our own time, for those entrepreneurs out there. Like, you can create something really cool that you think is awesome that just everyone's going to buy, but make sure it's not toxic. Because the problem is once it's out there, like it's a global contaminant that, you can't get back. You could think of microplastics as like totally related to this. Like it's just everywhere. And what's the long-term systemic effects? Who knows? And I think it goes back to your point. It's the same thing. I don't know how we're going to be able to prove these connections. Yeah. But we know that it can. So that's why you have state governments, and agencies that are kind of taking this on and saying like, we're not going to have an individual we can prove their prostate cancer is caused by this, but we know these things are linked. You got to clean it up. But the problem is cleaning it up costs billions of dollars. I mean, maybe trillions. I don't even know, given scale.
Yeah. And there's another side to this maybe, and just to like play a little bit of devil's advocate, I don't know, but you mentioned microplastics, and it's something that I pay a lot of attention to. And again, inescapable, right? In the water supply, in the food supply, like the packaging, like, phthalates come out of those plastics, end up in our blood supply, measurable in our urine, to the fact where you've got infants in hospitals whose phthalate levels in their urine can be directly correlated to the number of IVs going into their body. Like this is direct cause and effect. Wow. Simultaneously, plastic has saved billions of lives, right? And the infants needed those IVs. It's like, we're not going to get mad about that, are we? Like, yeah, they've got phthalates in their urine. That's unfortunate, right? But they needed this medicine. So it's like, it's
There's
not
an IB
perfect,
bag.
right? Yeah. What are you supposed to do about this? You know what I mean? And okay, so
I think,
this,
just to play. So I love that, the way you went about it, because it's like, how do we do it? I've thought a lot about this. I think part of the answer with things like plastics is put them in the IV bag.
right.
Use it for the important cardiac equipment that's going to keep someone alive. Don't put it in a single-use plastic container that's going to be used once
Yeah.
and then thrown away. Don't put it into a shirt that's going to get washed, and just because it's cheaper, and you're going to have these microfibers going everywhere. It strikes me that, like, there's a balance between the utility of this incredibly, versatile resource and where it should be used, and just the fact that we just made it, just everywhere because it's cheap. I mean, look, I'm a person who thinks about this a lot. This is glass, my lunch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I even think about it like, oh, dang it, I got a plastic top. But like, it's almost impossible in the world we live in. And so I think, part of it, unfortunately, as an individual, I mean, some of this is going to have to be systemic change, where we're like, look, we can't have this single-use stuff. This is just not healthy, right?
Yeah.
Whereas maybe plastic has a place for that IB bag.
Maybe. Yeah. Certain use cases. Interesting.
Yeah.
So do you think this is a boogeyman that could come to the forefront for Beyer? Like, you seem to mention, you knew that they were worried about it. So they've recognized this as a vulnerable point, right?
Yes.
And any idea into steps they might be taking to get in front of this, or early?
I'm kind of watching it from afar right now. It certainly will be something I'm going to talk on Monday. I mean, that's question number one for me, is like, hey, he knows I'm watching this stuff too. It's like, I have Google alerts up, and every week I'm seeing, I was getting, I get nervous because I'm like, when people say, well, which cases? I'm like, which one? I can't keep up. I mean, there's just like, there's so many that are happening, and they seem to be settling them. But I'm kind of like, where does this end? How many can you settle if you're going to have different municipalities, different states doing it?
Yeah.
I don't know. And so it's a tricky one for me. Like Agent Orange, you could argue, even there, I mean, it's still, that's the problem with these chemicals, is that the liability is just the permeability, like the ability of this stuff just to drift and go anywhere. It's like, and when you're the only producer of it, that's the thing. It's like, it's what a conundrum.
You know where this came from. Yeah.
You can't hide.
No. I want to talk about your next book, and what inspired you to write it, Country Capitalism. And so, Citizen Coke, you ended up, it was your first book, published in 2014, and you ended up in Peru with the coquilleros, like on the ground, figuring out this industry. Fascinating stories, by the way. Citizen Coke is a worthwhile read. And then into Seed Money, which is the origins of Monsanto, related to the story, because Coca-Cola funded early stages of Monsanto in order to get their caffeine supply, right? And synthesize caffeine. Country Capitalism, we talked about it super quick before I hit record, but what did you write about, Bart? What, because you just submitted the final yesterday, you said, of this draft, right? Correct?
Yes.
Not a draft.
And Jay, if there's such a thing as an exclusive with a historian, you have it, because I haven't talked to anybody about this book. I don't think it's nearly as juicy as like a real exclusive with, who's going to be Speaker of the House. But here, this really came as a result of a press reaching out to me and saying, we'd love for you to write something, and giving me kind of free rein and support and resources to do it while I was writing the Monsanto book. And to be honest, given the darkness of the things we've just talked about, I thought, let's write about something that I've always really wanted to write about. And so I ended up writing this book really about home, in a way. I grew up in the American South in Georgia, and I went off to school in New England. I went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and I remember arriving and just like having a real identity crisis, because people had perceptions of where I was from that didn't quite fit with what I thought where I was from was what it was like, And I think it was, this kind of perception of the South as a backwards place. And I don't think anybody thought I didn't have shoes growing up or things like that. But I know that my father, who had also spent time outside the South, had people say stuff like that to him because he grew up in Alabama. But it was along the lines of like, it's not a very enlightened place and all this. And I understood that from the perspective of having lived in the South and understanding the racial inequality and the poverty and all sorts of things that the South had, and how far behind in terms of public education and other things it was in many states. And so I got that, but I also was like, yeah, but the South is also like an economic kind of titan in a lot of ways. I think the idea a lot of people have is almost like kind of gone with the wind. It's like cotton and sugar and agriculture, and that's certainly part of the South. But I grew up in Atlanta. I was around Coca-Cola. The Olympics came in 1996. I thought of myself as like very cosmopolitan, and I thought of the businesses around me as like the businesses running the economy. Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, the largest airline in the world, UPS headquartered there. CNN, of course, like was blowing up at the time, and it was just like Ted Turner.
Yeah.
It was just a very different image. So the book really, it looks at 5 different Southern companies. It looks at the history of Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, Walmart, which is the largest corporation in the world, Walmart, from Bentonville, Arkansas, a town of 50,000 people. And FedEx started in Memphis, Tennessee, and Bank of America, which is in Charlotte, which has California connections, but North Carolina actually is really important to the story and why they're.
It's a good selection of like diversity of industries. Yeah,
a diversity of industries, but really what drew me to them. First of all, I wanted to look at what were the big. I didn't want to just pick small players like Bank of America, biggest bank in one of the biggest banks in the world. It was the biggest bank in the world. It goes back and forth. Delta was the largest airline. Delta is Mississippi Delta. Nobody knew this stuff, but I knew all this stuff. It was named after the Mississippi Delta because they were a crop dusting company in the American South in the 1920s. And so what I wanted to say was like, how do these companies make money? Like, what makes them so powerful? I mean, Walmart is, again, the largest corporation in the world, coming out of a small town, Bentonville. How? Coca-Cola, you could argue, coming out of the Jim Crow South in 1886. What? Became the largest, recognized next to OK around the world. Everybody knows it. And it turned out the argument became, and I didn't anticipate finding this when I looked at all these corporations, looking at their financials and everything else. It's country capitalism, folks. Turns out that what really made them great was that they were all trying to figure out how to get things from, remote places to rural markets, or really a better way of putting it is they served rural markets. Like Coke was trying to figure out how to get their product into the smallest little towns and nook and crannies in the American South and beyond.
Yes.
Walmart, when they first were citing their stores, they were citing their stores in towns of 5,000 people. That was what was different about them than Target or Kmart. They were staying in the metropolitan areas because they were like, you got to go where the people are. Walmart proved that you could go into these small towns and people would come there because you could become the market in places where there really wasn't much going on, and people would drive 50, 60 miles to get cheap goods there.
Yeah.
Proved the concept, and they did. FedEx, there were already airlines that could ship things overnight via passenger airliners to the major cities. But what FedEx saw, Fred Smith, who, by the way, interesting thing that I did. I feel like I'm giving away his email now. I won't tell you what it is, but I sometimes just play with emails to see if I can get lucky, and I did with him. And I just
around. I've done that.
Yeah, and sure enough, Fred Smith writes me, and I'm like, whoa, cool. The founder of FedEx, and got some cool interviews out of that, but that are in the book. And anyway, what's clear from talking with them is that it was about the small package market. They were trying to get to those smaller cities that weren't being serviced and doing it with smaller planes. So like trying to figure out how to do it. So really the South, I would argue, and I didn't anticipate seeing this, but I'm really excited. It's the first time I get to talk about it, was a place where like the conduits of capitalism were born, where like companies, because they were in a rural place, had to figure out how to get goods from like, these really niche markets. but that became our economy, the Amazon economy. Like it became the way that we do this. And then I started reading Jeff Bezos's work and I started being like light bulbs, because he's referencing Walmart. He's hiring people from Walmart to teach him how to do the logistics of it. He references Bank of America because they figure out how to get credit to small markets, you know. He literally says we built on top of that infrastructure in his own writings. Like we would not the Amazon economy wouldn't exist but for these conduits of capitalism that were built before me. He mentions FedEx, like that express air, like you can get it overnight. If they hadn't have done it, our economy wouldn't exist. So I'll sum it up by just saying, I think we got the American South wrong. You know, I think it's actually central to our economy and the way it functions today. You could argue it revolutionized our logistics systems. And it's in part because of its rurality, which I think we think of as an antithesis to capitalism, but in fact was a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, I wouldn't have, I'm looking forward to reading this. So that's the thread, whether it's FedEx, Walmart, Coke, Delta, B of A, it's their focus away from the metropolitan crowded bet that Target, whoever else is making. And they're like, no, there's maybe 50 mega cities we could hit, but there's 3,000 tiny ones. And if we can permeate those.
Yeah. And, you know, in some cases like Delta Airlines, you know, also developing things like the hub and spoke model, which became like the model for a lot of airlines. A lot of airlines weren't using that hub and spoke system. Delta was the pioneer in the American airline industry to do that in 1955. And that's why Atlanta became such a big hub, because you have all these smaller southern towns that they had air traffic rights to, because it was controlled by the federal government. You know, all these different, you had to get approval for different flight paths. And so Delta Airlines, being in the South, being this crop dusting company that emerged as a passenger airline, had that, but you had small towns. You got like Macon, Georgia and Greenville. So how are you going to make money? Well, you feed everybody into Atlanta and then you take them to LA, right? And you do it that way. And so then, but it's all connected because FedEx sees this and is like, that's how you can do this with packaging. And that's how, I don't know if you know this, but that's how FedEx works. Like all the packages came to Memphis and they get there between 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock. I think it's like 2 o'clock's the cutoff or whatever. They have to get in and then it's sorted and then all the planes are shifted out and then they go back out to whatever city it was. So you can see the environmental historian in me, by the way, likes all these stories because there's also an environmental story. Like that's a terribly inefficient way, like greenhouse gas wise, to do it. Because like, let's say you're shipping a package to San Francisco. It's not going, you know, when it originally was conceived, it wasn't just going straight from San Francisco to LA. It was going to Memphis and then back out.
Yes. That's wild.
And last thing I'll say about this, Memphis, like it's all about the environment. They chose this because of the environment. They wanted to be far enough south so that they didn't have the snowstorms of the north, which would disrupt all their logistics. And they wanted to be far enough north that they didn't have the hurricanes and tropical storms and stuff like that was affecting the, you know, the coastal areas further south. So Memphis was a great spot.
Did you find anything cultural or like historical about the area that would have inspired that style of business where it wouldn't have maybe on the eastern seaboard or on the West Coast?
One thing that I think I thought about this a lot that I think mattered was, well, two things. These guys didn't have a lot of cash. You know, if you think about Asa Candler, like we think of Coke as this like amazingly profitable firm, but these were guys coming out of the Reconstruction era South. They just got their butts whooped in the Civil War. You know, they didn't have any money. And you could argue that the strategy of kind of being a conduit was a smart strategy for somebody who doesn't have a lot of cash. Like, let me be a broker in the economy. I kind of think of these companies more as brokers now. Like they're people that are like helping get stuff that's made by other people from over here, logistically here. But that's really what they're in the business of doing, because they don't have enough capital, like have a big factory to, well, they didn't when they started. Right now they're huge, but when they started, they were just scrappy little firms. And you could argue that like being the conduits of capitalism was a smart strategy for people that were capital starved in many of these places. The other thing I'll say is, when you think about Walmart, for example, the trucking system that they developed was a product of the rurality and the shift in agriculture that was happening. You know, people were being pushed off farms as mechanization was coming in. You had all this cheap labor, and a lot of that cheap labor ended up becoming, non-union truckers who were trying to find another way to put bread on the table. And because you had so many people that were out of a farm job in those markets, you had low distribution costs because you didn't have to pay people really high, salaries to do that work. So I would also argue that the decline of rural farming, or I should say, the consolidation of farms, especially in the American South, created a labor market, cheap labor market that helped feed these companies' growth as well.
Interesting. When is it on shelves, Bart?
May 23rd, it comes out, and I'll be hanging out in the American South for much of that month, which is kind of nice to get to go home for a book tour there. So love to see any of your listeners who might be down there. Maybe make it to Canada too. We'll see.
Yeah, make it. I love it. Side question, where do you think that perception comes from? Like, I think about songs like Southern Accents by Tom Petty, where he kind of addresses the perception of how he grew up and who he is as a person because he's from the South. And you spoke to this, there's this misconception about what it's like down there, where you thought your experience was, I grew up in this metropolitan hub of the American economy, right? Evidence of that is the legacy of some of the biggest companies in the world that's come out of here.
Yeah. I think there's a way of writing off people and places that I think is really problematic today, especially in our kind of divided society. I think we see things as red states and blue states, which, of course, as a historian, we can show that these are always in flux. And it's still true today that I have friends of mine from school that'll send me kind of disparaging news from my home state to kind of remind me of how, problematic it is. And I don't need any reminder. I mean, I went to graduate school to study the problems with Southern public education because I taught in those schools and experienced those schools, and I know how systemic racism and things like that can lead to these problems. And so these are all real things, but I think the problem is that often the people that are most vulnerable in these societies get blamed or get poked fun at in ways that I think is really dangerous. I think about Mountain Dew, for example. When it first came out, people might not know this, but Mountain Dew was referencing moonshine. It came out of Johnson City, and the original advertisement for it was this kind of hillbilly, for lack of a better word, but that's how they would have described it, right? Person with teeth that are falling out and kind of a hat. And the original slogan for Mountain Dew was, Yahoo! Mountain Dew tickles your innards, playing up on this kind of Southern colloquialism and things like this, but also Appalachia Southern poverty. And I always point to that, and the students, we always joke about it a little bit, right? And I do too, because the slogan's just ridiculous and all this. But then again, it's we just take one step back and we think about the ways in which the Beverly Hillbillies or whatever all this is, these pictures of people without teeth, how that is acceptable. And yet it's a product of, extreme poverty that's brought about by policies that led to people, being in situations where they didn't have access to dental care. How funny is that, right? And so it's I think as somebody who's lived in those places, and granted, I lived in Atlanta, but of course, if you're from the South, have family in Alabama and different places more rural, you're attentive to the fact that that a lot of this is just a lack of access to, whether it be healthcare or public education or whatever it might be. And instead of lopping these people off as backward or stupid, maybe we should think about how do we think about the changes we might be able to enact to help these places become places where people do have adequate healthcare, do have adequate public education. So it's not like I don't see those problems. In fact, I'm motivated to do something about them. That's my whole life, I think, has been focused on that. But it's just it's amazing how in our society today, I think it's the Twitter sphere and everything else, how we can just dehumanize people. you know? And it goes back to Beyer, like just not being willing to accept that there might be somebody inside these corporations who really is trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Why not? You know, give people the full range of human emotions they deserve. I never now make fun of somebody who loves Canada or make fun of somebody who loves the South, or if they love Boston, great, you know, or Philadelphia, you know, I think I'm just more appreciative of the fact that, you know, some place is home to somebody, and try and find something that's, you know, that's good about that place, and be a little bit more gracious in the way we interact with one another. I think that would, summary statement, I think that would be good for society.
Is this your next book, Bart? As you're walking through this, I'm like, man, this is obvious.
Well, I have a wonderful agent who is like, let's go. We ready for the next project? And I think that's his job, you know? And
Yeah.
I'm pressing pause for the first time in my life. And I want to think about what I want to do next. I really want to take some time, and I don't even want to hint in this conversation about what it is. I have all these ideas going, but it's kind of fun for the first time in my life. I think we're around the same age, you know, I'm like, got a two-year-old and a 5-year-old, and just being able to pause, having gone through that pandemic and all the wildness and raising kids and everything else, and writing these books and just going full bore and trying to make it in my career, and kind of arriving and being like, okay, what do I do now? And I don't know what the second half's going to be, but I'm thinking it could be something totally radically different. It may not be books. It may be something totally different.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Huh.
Midlife crisis. I don't know.
Yeah, bring it on, right?
But
radical transformation.
But I think that, but the last thing I want to say, Jay, is I really do appreciate like you reaching out and giving historians and people like us who write these books a platform to talk about it with a very different audience, because this is the best part of doing what we do and getting to meet people through this amazing interface of podcasts and everything else. So thank you for having me.
Oh, dude. Pleasure's all mine. Honestly, it's the best part about having a podcast is I can read a book and then talk to the author, which is pretty unique. It's pretty unreal.
Well, we'll definitely send you a copy so you can get a copy of Country Capitalism.
Rad. Thanks so much. All right, Bart, look, man, this has been fun. Thanks again for coming on. And, you know, let's do it again sometime.
Sounds great.
We actually need to have a damn good recession.
The Russian economy is a gas station run by the mafia.
$41 trillion has been created out of nothing.
There's a stranglehold in China on most of these resources.
The outlook and fundamentals for the metals remains very, very strong.